So, good evening. I know most of you have had a very busy day and you came from work and now you are here. So, the most important thing is that when you're here, that one has to rest one's mind, that one's mind has to be in a relaxed state. This is very important. All the things that we have been through in our busy schedule, we have to leave that, We have to, we should not also take all of those or bring them with us. Instead, they should be left at the gate. They should be left there, and when you come here, then our mind should be free of all those stressful thoughts or distractions, etc. And instead, here, when we listen to the Dharma, as it is mentioned in the lamrim, that one has to listen to the Dharma with the correct motivation, with the right motivation, and I think the basis for this correct motivation is a certain level of, I think, a certain restful state of the mind, a mind that is free from stressful thoughts and perhaps like painful emotions like that. So the mind should be conducive in order to then, I think, to look towards the Dharma, to look towards the Dharma. So like this. Tantra, this is a word that is, I think, now quite popular, in the West, in the East, everywhere, this word, we always hear this word Tantra everywhere. This word is now being used not only within the Buddhist or Hindu, but also sometimes it's also being used in a more secular setting as well, such as its popularity. And it is said that in ancient India, Tantra was practiced in utmost secrecy. It was the esoteric practice of it was considered an esoteric practice, and there are, stories of, I think, Nalanda masters and other masters who, on the outside, did not display any kind of tantric practice, but when they passed away and when the room was cleared, then they would find tantric articles such as the Vajra and Ganda like this, So Tantra was practiced in utmost secrecy, and then with its flourishing in Tibet, then the Tibetans, they really, it was practiced then it was practiced more openly. It was practiced more openly, and then we have the empowerments, the initiations, and so forth. It became quite popular. So the Tibetans sort of popularized this very secret esoteric practice. The Tibetans, of course, we have to take the credit for that. for popularizing this. There's also this one Tibetan saying that an Indian practices one deity but then achieves 100. But a Tibetan practices 100 deities, yet achieves not one, you know. So this is partly is because of the proliferation of this very secret practice, you know, of this secret practice. And the thing is that, you know, as I think, if you have to do something that has much meaning, and if it is a big plan, then if you sort of announce your motivation, your plan to the whole world, then there's more likely that one would meet obstacles, right? But when you set out to do something big, then it's better in the initial stages to not sort of announce it, right? So likewise, since the tantric path is a very profound and vast path, then it is better that one does not sort of make this so open, you know, but rather one keeps this to oneself and then wholeheartedly practice it like this. And perhaps one reason why Tantra draws much attention is that with the tantric rituals, it's not so boring, you know. It's on the contrary, it's quite exciting, and you have many things going on, and you see all different. You hear, or there are many different like mudras, and you see all these different sounds, right? So it seems exciting, right? It seems exciting, and that's, I think, one reason why it draws people, right? It draws people's attention. It seems exciting. I guess that's what we want, you know. We want some excitement, right? Whereas if you really think about, you know, the Four Noble Truths and go back to the Buddha's core teachings, then there isn't that excitement, you know. So I think like this, in this way, then this is why Tantra is really popular, right? Or it has become so popular. But having said that, it is so important that when we sort of are in this environment, we are exposed to these aspects of the Tantra, it is important that we have to understand the meaning behind that, you know. This is very important. For example, when we see these iconographies, you know, these Thangka paintings, when we see the male and the female aspects of the deity, you know, embracing, etc., like that, then if we are not careful, then some of us, we might have some misunderstandings, you know, misconceptions might arise from seeing those images. So it's important that we have to understand the meaning behind that, and most importantly, these kind of images are not to be taken literally, you know, they are not to be taken literally, but rather they are mere symbols, you know, they are mere symbols of the path that is included within that system. So in the case of Guhya Samaja, you know, each of the colors and the various aspects of the deities, they correlate with some of the paths that is included within that Guhya Samaja system, you know. So like this, then we have to approach these images like that. And also when we have, you know, some images of a wrathful deity, you know, wrathful deity, then again we have to take that as the practice that encompasses purifying anger or turning anger into the path, right? So this is how one must interpret these images. And then how does one enter the tantric path? Well, then first there are prerequisites. So the prerequisites would be the foundational teachings of the Buddha. So starting with, of course, the Four Truths, so that the practitioner needs to be well versed, in the Four Truths, must have a certain, I think, like experience, certain experience of having meditated on the Four Truths, and sort of has gained a taste of suffering, a taste of suffering. So beginning with the truth of suffering, to sort of develop a sense of a taste of what suffering really is, So this is very important. So to start like this, from the truth of suffering, then this is of utmost importance, before one actually enters, the tantric path. So when we begin with suffering, the two types of suffering is something not so sort of emphasized, right? But the Dharma is really about overcoming the third type of suffering, right? It is about overcoming this conditioned existence, the conditioned suffering. So this we have to keep in mind, when we think of Dharma, that this is what we are trying to overcome, not the first two types of suffering, but it is really the third type of suffering, which is the subtle suffering. And this is why the Buddha gave his teachings, this is why the Buddha started sharing his Dharma. And this is because he saw this existence as suffering, Whereas if one does not sort of follow in the Buddha's footsteps, then one wouldn't be able to recognize that state as a suffering state, right? So this is very important. So like this, and then thinking about, why we are in this kind of conditioned existence, why, and then this would lead to the origin of suffering, namely karma and klesha, actions and afflictive emotions, and like this, and then thinking about the cessation, and then the path, the eightfold path, and so forth, like this. The eightfold path, or which then can be included in the three trainings, Is it the three trainings, right? The three trainings. So like this, then one has to sort of meditate on this. This is more like an analytical meditation. And then having done that, then previously we were using mainly ourselves as the subject, as the object of suffering, when we think of how we are suffering, right? And then we shift onto others and reflect on how others are also suffering, are going through the same situation just like ourselves. When we reflect on that, then this leads to the cultivation of compassion. This leads to the cultivation of unconditional love and compassion. And then having reflected like this, and then we think of, well, if this is how we and others suffer in this cyclic existence, in samsara, then what is the way out of that, right? So then, which then leads us to the concept of emptiness, how by utilizing emptiness, then one is able to sort of reverse this order, this order of the afflictive emotions, first beginning with ignorance, which then gives rise to attachment, and then aversion, like this. So we then use emptiness to sort of reverse that order. So if you think like this, then Je Rinpoche, how he terms it, the three principal aspects of the path, So by thinking about how we ourselves suffer, then these the result would be renunciation, and by reflecting on how others suffer in the samsara, then the result would be bodhichitta, and then thinking about why this is the case and how we should reverse that, then this leads to the correct view, because all of these mental afflictions, they arise as a result of having an incorrect view of phenomena, of how things exist, right? Of how things exist. So for this, then, this is why emptiness, the concept of emptiness, is considered so important, because it can be used in order to overcome, ignorance, right? Otherwise, emptiness itself as a viewpoint, as just being a philosophical point, is not so useful. It's just like one of those. It's just like one of those, like, food for thought kind of things, right? But if one can use the concept of emptiness in order to sort of contradict, with how we are presently seeing things, then emptiness has some usage, Emptiness, then this gives emptiness some value. So it's important that we always try to not approach emptiness as strictly a philosophical point or something like that, but rather it should be how we should try to use emptiness and then sort of turn that into our way of seeing and viewing things, which will then really give emptiness that power, or its value. So like this, then one has to first engage in the three principal aspects like this. For us, the biggest block to really practice the Dharma is, of course, attachment. Is attachment, desire. So therefore, then when the Buddha talked about suffering, he first talked about impermanence. Impermanence. In our current state, how we wish things to be, then I think we would wish to be. We would wish things to be permanent. When we're having a good time, we would then wish that it would always be like this, for the rest of our lives. And like in many of these children's stories, then at the end they say something like, "And they lived happily ever after," So from a very young age, I think this thinking is almost ingrained, within us, right? But this is really like a child's thought, It's not true, That's not possible. So we have to sort of get rid of this view, We have to. This is just wishful thinking, So we have to overcome that and face to reality. This is very important. So thinking about impermanence, and sometimes impermanence is like a euphemism for death. So we have to really think about our death and how that death could happen any given moment. It could happen any time. So by thinking about death, impermanence, then I think it is possible then that it's possible that there is a shift in our approach, in our approach to life. By thinking about death, then we can sort of shift our focus from just this life, just the pleasures of this life, and then we can think about the future lives, And most of us, obviously because of our Buddhist background, we already believe in future lives. We already believe in rebirth. But we have to again sort of remind ourselves that this Buddhist concept of rebirth, it is rooted in this concept of beginningless, beginningless. How our mind does not have a beginning, right? And so this is very important, that there is no first cause. There is no first cause in Buddhism, because everything is dependent arising. Everything arises from causes and conditions. So therefore, the mind should also have a cause and a condition, right? And the cause refers to something like a substantial cause, like a continuum. So this is sort of like some of the logics we use, some of the reasonings that we use for sort of reaffirming our belief in future lives like this. And using this method, then it seems pointless to be so focused on just this life, to sort of dedicate all of our energy just towards this life, then seems in a way trivial, that we should try to see the bigger picture and have like a long-term plan, have a long-term plan and not be so focused on just this life. So this is like the first shift that needs to take place, we have to sort of turn away from just being so focused on this life. Because if we do not shift from that, if we do not part away from that kind of thinking, that kind of approach, then we would always have this challenge, We would always face this stumbling block in all aspects of our path, This will, and this also then I think will take some of the enthusiasm or some of the joy from really practicing the Dharma, right? Because if we are only focused on this life, then what is the point of Dharma? If we are only focused on this life, then why Dharma? There is really no reason to practice the Dharma, right? Then there is no reason to really practice renunciation, and there is no reason to really generate unconditional compassion for all beings if it's only about this life, right? So this is something that's very important, and this is why we have to think more and more about impermanence, impermanence of things. I think that needs to be stressed, in our minds, especially in our daily lives. Then we have to always remind ourselves of this fact, that we won't be in this on this planet forever, So to also remind ourselves that it's like a journey, that there will be a time when we have to progress, we have to then go to the next level, to the next life. So if you think like this, then I think this then would sort of set the ground, set the stage for Dharma practice. This current rebirth, the human rebirth, it's said to have many qualities, right? Many qualities. Well, what is the term? Those 18, is it the leisures and freedom?
Yeah, 8 freedom and 10 endowments.
Oh, 8 freedom and 10 endowments, right? Like this. So many good qualities, but the most important ones is that in our present human existence, in this human form, we have this ability, we have the human intelligence, the human intelligence. Even though some other animal species, some of them exhibit a certain level of intelligence, yet they do not, I don't think they can really think about, so much about the past, and they don't really think too much about, the far future. They don't have this ability, right? They don't have this ability to think of the 3 times, right? As we do, or as we can. So this is one thing that we have, and then also this capacity to generate a immeasurable compassion or great compassion is also, I think, a unique quality of the human rebirth. So these 2 things, I think, are the main qualities that we as human beings we have. And intelligence and this compassion, they are not 2 independent things. Why we have the potential to develop this great compassion is because of our intelligence, right? Because we can use our intelligence to enhance our compassion. Whereas if we lack this intelligence, then our compassion will just remain as just that we cannot, by way of thinking, be able to make that any greater, right? So these 2, the human intelligence and the human capacity for love and compassion, this is a great gift that we all have, and it's important that we have to sort of then use that, that we have to use that to sort of activate, to activate those potentials. Because if we do not take advantage of that, then we are really missing out, We are really missing out on what makes this human existence so special and so great. So it's important that we have to acknowledge that we have this immense potential of using our intelligence and using of having this great intelligence, and then also being able to use that in order to enhance our compassion and kindness towards others. So this, the wisdom aspect and the method aspect is very important. We all have this natural capacity, this potential to develop, the method and wisdom. As human beings, these are our greatest gifts. So like this, and then when we try to practice, the Mahayana, the great vehicle, the great path, the great way, we have many challenges, right? We face many challenges because of our self-cherishing mind, because of our self-cherishing approach. Then sometimes when we try to engage on that path, then we take a few steps back because of that, because of our self-centered attitude, because of self-centeredness. So when that happens, then what do we do? How do we deal with that, right? So one way of looking is that humility is very important. Humility is very important when engaging on the Bodhisattva path. This is very important, as it is mentioned in the 8-verse mind training, 8-verse lojong. Then that it's important that if we find ourselves sort of really emphasizing just ourselves and our happiness like that, then at times it's important that we try to put others before us, and figuratively speaking, to sort of put them higher, and we should consider ourselves lower than all others. So this is a figurative way of looking, and it's a figurative way of overcoming this self-centered attitude. And also to not feel entitled. I think it's very important, because when we find ourselves in a happy state, then we have to acknowledge that this is due to the kindness of others, that whatever good things we may have, or whatever happy state we may be in, it is due to the kindness of others, so if we are able to link our happiness to the effort of others, then I think this helps in appeasing this kind of approach, where we think this is all due to my efforts and my efforts alone, or we feel, oh, I'm entitled to this, So like this, then if we think like this, then this also, I think, it is like a preemptive method, so that down the road we won't have this strong feeling of ourselves, We won't have this very strong sort of arrogance, this arrogant approach or arrogant attitude. Because with arrogance, then this hinders in developing unconditional compassion for others, It gets in the way of that. So it's important that whenever we face this kind of challenges, when we try to engage on the path, then it is important that we then try to utilize that corresponding remedy, the antidote to that kind of approach. So this is very important, that we have to, practicing the Dharma. I think it takes much effort on the practitioner's part. It is like a constant that one has to always. It's a work in progress, that one has to constantly work on one's mind and sort of fine-tune one's mind, and to make sure that the negative emotions or the negative side of our minds is not sort of taking over our minds, So to always, being very careful and being, watchful of our minds. So this is something that one has to always bring to use when engaging specifically the Mahayana path. And then thinking about the law of karma is again very important. It is, I think, very helpful in sort of making us responsible for our own actions, So this is very important also, to always think not only on the Mahayana but also on the non-Mahayana path. Karma is very important, right? So again, that is something that one should not overlook, and then trying to apply the law of karma to our actions, So in other words, then we have to take responsibility for our own actions. So this is very important. I think like this. And also with the law of karma, again, there's that connection with dependent arising as well, right? So if you can think of dependent arising, then naturally you would come to karma. There's no way that one can avoid karma if one really sort of thinks deeply about dependent arising. Then you have it comes down to karma then, right? It has to. So like this, and then applying the concept of karma, the cause and effect to one's own karma, to one's own action. This is again very important. So just wanted to remind all of us of that. So having then, not just having some knowledge about these different steps, but actually trying to think about this on a daily basis and making this, these way of approaching life, of ways of looking at life, and practice these practices. When one actually makes this part of one's own being, this viewing and this approach and this practice as one's own daily practice, then one is, I think, then suitable, to practice. One becomes a suitable vessel to practice the tantric path, to practice tantra. So I think today I would like to just talk about some of the preliminaries, the preliminary teachings or the preliminary parts that one has to practice before entering the tantric way, the tantric path. And with that, maybe we could have a question-answer session now. Yeah.
Rinpoche, earlier you said that we should plan for our future life, and while I'm contemplating of my future life, I cannot help myself to wish that in my next life I'll be born female again. I think this is wrong, right?
Could you translate that? Yes. So the question was that when you think about future lives, you can't help not to think to be reborn as a female.
I can't help to want to be born as a female again.
Oh, so you want to be born as a female again, right? Okay. And then the question was, is that okay? Is that okay to think like this? Oh. I think it's okay. Yes. Of course, when it comes to practicing the Dharma, then male and female, it makes no difference, right? On the contrary, as a female, I think it is easier to also generate love, to generate loving kindness, because you already have this strong mother instinct, right? So one can then use that to generate a more greater love, right? An unconditional love for all sentient beings. So as a female, I think you have that advantage. So when it comes to practicing the Dharma, these two forms, female and male, it doesn't make any difference.
Just want to ask you, when is the right time to start the tantric practice? What is the right degree of practice then you can start?
Usually, we say someone who has had a certain experience in the common path, So the common path meaning the path that is common to the person of small capacity, and then, the path that is common with the person of the middling capacity, and then the person of the highest capacity. So the three paths that accords with the three types of persons. Someone who is well versed and has gained a certain experience, a certain taste, right? That there is a strong feeling, not just mere words, but it comes from the heart, right? So when you reach that level, then it is said that then you are ripe. Now you may practice the tantric path. But again, that again is reaching that level, that kind of level is easier said than done, right? Developing this, even not spontaneous bodhicitta, but even like a non-spontaneous bodhicitta, as we say, tasting like not the actual sugar cane, but the skin of the sugar cane, that bodhicitta, even that level, to achieve that level, it takes much effort, even reaching to that level is very difficult, right? If one does not put so much effort in all these steps, if one does not dedicate his or her time in these lamrim points, it would be very difficult to even come to that level. So having said that, then I think, and also, in the future, in the past there have been stories of people who were quite new to Buddhism, but then they took so many tantric initiations, and not just any tantric initiations, but the Anuttara Yoga Tantra tantric initiations, the highest yoga, the highest tantra initiations. And some of those practitioners to this day, even though when they began, they did not have such a strong ground, if I could say, let's say it like this, but when I see them now, they're in a very good position, that they have a very strong faith, and their practice seems to be quite strong, So sometimes it's difficult to say that even for someone who may not have been who may not have a strong background or not strong exposure to the common paths, but they have a very strong, it seems like a very strong imprint, from past lives, that they have this very strong, they really take on, the tantric path, right? And then later, then they go through these more common paths and common practices, and then they seem to then, think more and more about those, and then over the years, it seems that everything works out, everything works out. So sometimes I think it is difficult to say that in order to take an initiation that you must first, sort of attain this kind of level. I think sometimes for a certain type of person, it doesn't work out like that. So it's more like a case-by-case thing, I think it would be sometimes, it would be difficult to really sort of come with like the exact specification, right? But to put it more lightly, then I think if you are someone who has a very strong faith in this, in the tantric deity or in the lama, and you have this strong wish to practice this, then I think that is good enough, that is good enough. Because the reason why the tantric path was kept so secret was that people could misunderstand the tantric path, right? That was the main reason. And if you are someone who does not misunderstand it, misunderstand the tantric path, and if you are able to practice it correctly as per the guru's instructions, then even though you might not have such a strong background in the more common paths, but by taking this tantric initiation, it could inspire oneself to actually then go back to, go back to like kindergarten level, you know, right? Because you have this strong, it's almost like if you have this strong wish to be a doctor, then you might be really careful and then start doing everything correctly from level 1, right? So it could be like that kind of thing, that by developing this kind of closeness with the deity, and then when you are sort of told that in order to really practice this path, then you have to begin from, you know, the very core teachings of the Buddha, then that could give you an extra motivation, you know, that could give you an impetus to really work on those core teachings. So it could work out in different ways. So it's really difficult to say, you know, to sort of come up with a one-size-fits-all solution or measurement, you know, that I don't think I can really, you know, say that this is the true measure or this is the real prerequisite for actually receiving the tantric initiations.
Rinpoche, sorry, I have 3 questions for you. First question is, what is the benefit of entering tantric path? Second question is, do we really need to enter tantric path to attain enlightenment quickly? And the third one, is it if we enter tantric path, we must practice properly, obediently, otherwise we'll go to hell?
The motivation, you know, is mainly bodhichitta, right? If one's motivation for practicing the Dharma is bodhichitta, is full enlightenment, you know, for the sake of others, for freeing all other sentient beings from suffering, if this is the ultimate goal of one's Dharma practice, then of course it makes sense to enter the tantric path, you know, because not purely from the viewpoint of the result, because the result is the same, you know, whether one is on a paramita yana, you know, the perfection vehicle, or one is on the tantric path, the Vajra vehicle, the result, Buddhahood, is the same, you know, not from the viewpoint of the fruition. We do not differentiate between Tantra and non-Tantra Mahayana from the viewpoint of the result. We do not differentiate like that, but rather we differentiate, or the real unique quality of the tantric path is due to the speed, you know, due to the speed of attaining Buddhahood. You know, it's always explained from the viewpoint of the speed of the duration in which one can attain Buddhahood, right? So since the duration is shorter, then therefore, then this is, you know, obviously this is considered an advantage. And this is one thing. So, okay, so the first question, I think like this. Yeah. And one other, I think, like benefit is that in the tantric path, then the gap between the physical and the non-physical, namely the mind, is less. You know, is less. Whereas in the sutra, there is a big distinction. Whereas in the tantra, and as you go through higher and higher, then the physical and the non-physical, they are almost like the two sides of the same coin, of the same coin. So in many ways, then this also makes much sense for us, and also how in the Tantra we do not use the word abandon, abandon much, but rather we use the word. There's a tendency to use the word purifying, to purify the five aggregates, So like this, in this way, then I think the tantric path, it just resonates more with like our thinking and our present situation, how our aggregate, how our being is formed, So it really sort of brings the connection between the five aggregates more closer. So these are, I think, like some of the benefits of I could say some of like the unique features of the tantric path that you would not find in the sutra, that you would not find in the sutra text, in the sutra teachings. Yeah. What was the second part?
Second one is, should I change a bit? Do we really need to enter tantric path to attain enlightenment quickly, or why do we need to enter tantric path to enter tantric path to attain enlightenment quickly? Can these two, up to you?
Oh. Yes. So I think.
Do we really need to enter tantric path to attain enlightenment quickly, or can it be why do we need to enter tantric path to attain enlightenment quickly? Is it the same?
Yes, so the first was what are the benefits of the tantric path, right?
Yes, that's already answered.
So I think the first question and the second question
It's about the same.
is quite
That's
similar,
why,
right? Yes. So
okay, I go to the third one, right?
So then I think I remember the third question, right? Yes. So if you do not properly, if you do not, practice Tantra properly, if you do not practice that properly, then would we then be reborn in the hell realm, right? This was the third question? Excuse me? Yeah. Okay. So I don't think there's any need to translate what we said. But yeah. This is a very good question. In the Tantra, I think there's a term called Vajra hell, Vajra hell. So not just any hell, but Vajra hell. And this is, of course, only reserved for Tantric initiates, So this is a very special hell, right? It's almost like we are entitled, only we are entitled to that Vajra hell, right? It's a special place for us. But again, we have to be very careful, We have to sort of be skillful enough that we do not sort of, I think, belittle these kind of descriptions, and then at the same time, so if you do that, this would be like one extreme, and then on the other side, the other extreme would be that we take this too literally to the point that it scares us so much that we do not want to even engage on this path, or that having engaged on the path, then we are so afraid of making mistakes, of making even small mistakes, of even breaking some minor mistakes. So it's important that we do not fall into the pitfall of either one of these, And I think the best, there's even this story that I think one Lama was saying something like, if I I would rather be born in the health by breaking these samayas than not even taking this samaya in the first place, right? So there are such saying like this. So perhaps it's not so bad to be reborn in the Vajra hell after taking those great initiations, and rather than not taking the initiations and then not going to the Vajra hells as a result of that, or as a result of not sort of honoring those samayas, right? So I don't know. There are two ways of looking at it, and mostly I think nowadays people they don't really take much heed into this concept of you know of then of being reborn in the Vajra health as a result of not upholding the samaya or not honoring the vows. So I think for most of us, we are a bit like what this Tibetan Lama said, that we would sort of rather risk, going to the Vajra health. I mean, if we have the initiations, then it's almost like it's worth it, it's worth it. So like this.
Rinpoche, I received these questions for you. So question 1 is, how do we help our beloved ones to have a good rebirth if they are not Buddhist, besides praying for them? And then the question 2, apart from pujas, within 49 days after a person has passed away, is there anything we can do to push them to Pure Land?
The first one was, how do we help the beloved ones on the path when they are not Buddhists?
To have a good rebirth.
To have a good rebirth. I think, when we talk of the path that correlates with a person of the small capacity, these teachings is something like barring something like refuge, then I think the other things, it is something that one can share with also non-Buddhists. So not even religious non-Buddhists, but also in a secular setting as well, right? What we now, as His Holiness has been very much sort of like, I think, pioneered, this secular ethics and how he explains it. I think this is something that we can also follow in his footsteps, and also then impart, that ethic to the non-Buddhist, to non-Buddhists as well. I think that would be wonderful. His Holiness's book on secular ethics, I think like one of his more recent one is called Beyond Religion, right? Beyond Religion. So something like that, the teaching that is contained within that book by His Holiness, I think is something that one can share with everyone, with everyone. And if you follow those ethical standards, this is what the ethical standard is all about. It's about refraining from harm to other sentient beings, to refraining from harming other beings, and harming other beings is the main cause is what really sort of propels us to the lower realms, right? To the lower realms. So if one refrains from, from acts of harming others, then naturally, then this helps in taking a good rebirth, right? So like this. And then for the second question, then I think, so after 49 days, then we say that the person would have already taken a rebirth, a rebirth. So then how can we help them so that they may take rebirth in the Pure Land next life? Then this is a good question, but I think one way of helping any sentient being to be reborn in the Pure Land, I think, is to engage in the acts of the Bodhisattva, following the guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life by Shantideva. If one, with this great motivation, with this unequaled motivation, bodhicitta, and by engaging in the 6 perfections, I think this is the best way to sort of push others towards Pure Land. If you become a Buddha, what can be more pure than that, right? So if you become a Buddha, then your mind becomes pure from all obscurations, obscurations of afflictive emotions and obscurations of knowledge. So I think, by engaging in the acts of the Bodhisattva, I think is the way to help others attain, this pure aspect, this pure aspect of one's existence. So like this. So, okay, then I think I will stop for today. Thank you.